So Laura, Vanessa, thank you both for being here.
It's a pleasure.
It's fantastic to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
So we're here today to talk about your book, The Performance Curve, which I've had a little read of it, and it seems to me to be one of the closest things that I've seen to an antidote to hustle culture, right? You're making the case that a slowed down, a more considered and a more intentional life is one which is not only perhaps more worth living, but one that will actually get you more results in the long term. So just before we dive into the book, can you talk to me about what kind of problems you're looking to overcome in publishing this book?
Yeah, so thank you, Sean. And that's it, really. This book is about, how do we help people to live their best life? We only get one life, and let's make the most of it. And that's really what Vanessa and I are trying to do in our coaching work and for ourselves and for our families and the people around us. But what we've been observing over the last few years is how much the always-on, high-pressure culture, the push to perform and so on that we all, many of us feel is affecting that. Whether that's our client who we feature at the start of the book, who signed up to a gym with a creche for his young daughter, only to find that after a few weeks he actually started to use the creche for childcare whilst he got on with his personal admin, which obviously is, I can really identify with that, but it's not a life well lived. It's not good for him or his daughter or probably even for his work. Or, whether that's me, I think back to a time when I was on holiday in Italy a couple of years ago, and beautiful place with a lovely swimming pool. And I remember quite some time that I spent in a, albeit very nice little office in our villa whilst my daughter was at the pool with her friends and other members of the family. And those are choices which we can't take back. And I think we recognize that in ourselves and in many of the people that we work with and spend time with, that actually those trade-offs are not, that we're not making those trade-offs in a way that really represents what a life well lived looks like. So what we wanted to do with the book is really, first of all, ask people to step back and say, what is a life well lived for you, and what can we really do to help you go after that? And we wanted to help them to really get to that life well lived by bringing together all of the different elements of the experience that Vanessa and I had. Something we were very curious about was what could we create from bringing Vanessa's experience as a yoga teacher and a breathwork therapist, as well as obviously a business coach, together with my experience as a neuroscientist and psychologist. What could we have from that kind of breath, brain, body and business combination that would really be a valuable toolkit for having a life well lived?
Do you think, just on that point, that we as a society have fallen for an incorrect definition of performance and an incorrect definition of success? So I'm 26 years old, and ever since I've been working and growing a business, it seems to be that the only noise that comes from culture and from the internet is that if you're not working constantly, if you're not going all out and lacking sleep and lacking looking after yourself, you are not trying hard enough, you're not successful. And it was only maybe in the last 2 years that I've actually stepped back from that and realized that, if I'm putting 16, 18 hours a day into building something, but then never enjoying the upsides of building that, or even just enjoying the simple pleasures in life, despite what society would have me believe is success, I've almost gone on this journey of realizing that there is far more to life. Do you think that that is true of those that you speak to and interact with, that we've been missold what performance and success are?
I'd give a definite yes. And what we see changes things then is exactly what you're describing, is when people start to actually question what success means to them. For some people, it might bring a lot of fulfillment. It is a life well lived, that they're working a certain number of hours, but they're also managing to have balance in other ways of their life, and it works for them. But by and large, I would agree that we have mistaken busyness or effort for impact. And a lot of the personal development space, or also professionally, I think we're seeing a disentangling of that, and much more encouragement to also say, what does success mean to you? What is actually the impact you want to achieve, and how can you do that in the context of your life overall, like you were alluding to?
I really echo what Vanessa says, but also I build on that, which is I actually think, Sean, that we also can't get results. We can't be effective when we're pushing ourselves as hard as you described. So we can do that for a certain short period of time, but over the long haul, actually our effectiveness gets undermined by the fact that our well-being is not as strong as it should be. So what we've tried to do in this book we call the performance curve is look at the definition of performance and say, actually, we all want to be effective, but we all want well-being as well, partly to have a good life, as you described, but partly because the two things complement each other. When we're feeling better, we're going to be able to perform better, and when we perform better, it gives us we're going to be more effective, and when we are effective, we have a spring in our step, and we're out the door earlier and more able to enjoy our weekends, so our well-being is better. They work in a virtuous cycle, and I think when we stop and acknowledge that and then invest in both things, we start to get that virtuous cycle, which actually over time should hopefully unlock more impact, as Vanessa said, rather than have us just treading on the hamster wheel.
Yeah, and the key distinction here is what Laura mentioned on effectiveness rather than the busyness or be doing things. So what are the things that allow us to be effective and what really matters, and not just chasing that many posts or that many activities or emails to write off, but what are the ones that will make a difference, and being more discerning about that. And in order to be able to set those priorities, for example, and know what it is that matters and how to pursue it, it requires us to bring our best in terms of our brain, for example, our best brain functioning. And very often when we can't see the forest for the wood, what's the trees for the wood, it means then we get into this scattergun approach, but we're actually not really bringing the best of our brains.
So in the book, as a bit of context saying, you speak about there being two types of curve when it comes to how we go about trying to reach success. The first is the boom and bust curve, which when I was reading that section, it truthfully could have been a biography about me because I resonated with it so much. And the other is the alternative that you offer, which is the performance curve. So just so we're all on the same page here, can you quickly talk us through what the boom and bust curve is and what the performance curve is?
Yeah, they're great little shorthands to just identify which curve we're on and which way of operating we're falling into. So the boom and bust curve means we are responding to challenges as if they're threats or crises. So in an adrenaline-fueled way, and that's what's feeding what we just talked about, this sense of just, I need to keep being busy, or something else is almost like driving me internally to do those things without really having stepped back and thought about what the problem is and how best to approach it. And this adrenaline-fueled reaction means actually also in our brains that it reduces the activity in our prefrontal cortex, so our problem solving and how we collaborate with others is impacted negatively by that. So that means we're not able to really bring our best. For me, I really experienced being on the boom and bust curve as a management consultant. I got so absorbed on a project that everything else in life fell by the wayside. No hobbies, or really struggling to make time for friends, or it just wasn't enough. And I had a burnout in my late 20s, so that was really big bust in order to course correct. And that's why we call it boom and bust. So when we really just focus on this next thing and then maybe take a weekend or holiday to recover and then the next thing again, but we're very much adrenaline fueled in this fight, flight or freeze mode, responding to it. And really when we need it the most, then our brain can't bring its best. So that's the boom and bust curve, and learning what really puts us there. In my case, really needing to do things without flaws and perfectly. So focusing on that, so I wouldn't be able to couldn't poke any holes in it or find criticism in it. And that is what was driving me on the boom and bust curve there. And then the performance curve, by contrast, is actually where we're fueled by our sense of passion. We want to create things in life. We're seeing opportunities. So it's a very different way of operating. It doesn't mean there aren't challenges, but we're seeing the challenges from a point of view of being able to grow internally, helping us bring our best so our brain can really fire on all cylinders, because there isn't that sense of threat. Like, I'm not at risk in this new project, for example, then I wouldn't feel like something is at threat. But, oh, wow, it's a new challenge, it's a new project, let's see what we find out, a sense of discovery and seeing what we can create. So that is what allows us to to use challenges to grow, to help us through in the moment, but also build a longer term capacity to deal with uncertainty and complexity and change in a way that is better for our brains and our bodies. And then we get to that sweet spot of actually being able to be more effective and have more well-being at the same time. And that's something I then really learned through the burnout. I mean, that was a big course correction, but really to spot these triggers within myself and find when am I getting close to the boom and bust curve again, and how do I get myself off it? So being able to spot the signals when it's just, for me, it's just stopping to be fun. That's a good signal for me. When work is stopping to be fun, I know that I need to course correct a little bit. And it was also what made me first experience really how mutually reinforcing effectiveness and well-being can be. Because by working through my stuff with a burnout, when I came back to consulting afterwards, actually, I was a lot more effective. I was able to juggle a lot more things at the same time. It was easier. I was getting more done by having identified really what was driving me and finding other ways then of navigating myself and really managing myself there. So, for example, something around just getting something done first and the worst possible first draft and then perfecting it later is not just a little hack, but it really comes from knowing what my drivers are that get me on the boom and bust curve versus the performance curve. And it could be different for different people, but the thing is really to understand ourselves better in order to do better and feel better.
Do you think that the boom and bust curve is what we as humans default to? And if so, what's going on in the brain there? Is it anything to do with the hundreds of thousands of years of history where our lives very much have been, there's an adrenaline spike because you need to fix something, then you relax and regress, an adrenaline spike, and is this new world that we're living in the last, say, 30 or 40 years, the first opportunity that we've really had to aim in the very long term and build sustainable, planned progress in our lives?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. We, as when we were out surviving and in the jungle of previous times, then of course that adrenaline fueled uplift was necessary to run away from the tiger or hunt down some food or whatever it was, and then we'd go back and we'd recover in our caves and eat it and whatever. And that isn't there anymore, particularly I think in the last 40, 50 years, where, perhaps less actually, maybe 20, 30 years, where we've got this always on culture. We've always got that next LinkedIn post that we can make, or that next piece of work that we can get done, or email we can read or send. And so there's a constant stimulation and we get some dopamine hits from that. We get a boost from that. But actually the compounding and the effect on our nervous systems of pushing us into this kind of adrenaline and kind of cortisol state that is helpful for us to perform in the short term at a certain level. I mean, not beyond a certain level, but up to a certain level. But when it builds up over time, it's detrimental to our brains. It actually leads to structural changes in our brains that affect our ability to take decisions, bring our best thinking. That it's affecting the parts of the brain that allows us to operate at our very best.
Just to dive into that then, with these structural changes that happen within the brain due to this pattern that we all seem to live at some point in our lives, is it easier to unpick it sooner? So for example, if somebody is my age listening and they think I really need to get a grip of my personal and my professional life, and as such I need to fight against those hundreds of thousands of years worth of wiring and programming that's now changed my brain, compared to somebody in, say, their 50s or 60s who's listening to this and thinks, I also want to make that change. Is it easier to undo those structural changes sooner, or are we on a level playing field here?
So, two things, Sean. I think the first thing is, there are different kinds of changes that go on in our brain. So some are structural changes. And if you look at somebody who's had high levels of kind of chronic stress over their lifetime, they will have structural changes in their brain that actually, I don't think, can be unwound. You can't necessarily build those back. So actually, the earlier we get ourselves out of these patterns, probably the better it is for the health of our brain in our middle and late ages. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I I think at any age we can change. We all say, oh no, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but I would argue that you just teach an old dog new tricks in a slightly different way. Probably there's something slightly different going on in their brains, and they're probably going to get to it in a different way. I think generally, as we age, many of us get more perspectives, we get more capacity, and we talk about this in the book. It's a notion called vertical development, where we're more able to flex our mindsets. You know, we've had more experience, more life experiences that allow us to see that there are different ways to see things, and that perhaps the ways we saw things in the past didn't work out for us, and therefore, you know, we're not always right. We can be more flexible in our perspectives and our habits and so on. So I think that perhaps we gain more wisdom to do that as we age. That said, when we're younger, those habits and mindsets, which are essentially habits of mind, are less inbuilt. They're less trained into us. We've just thought them or done them less. So our brain is less in, you know, the pathways through our brain that create these automatic defaults are less embedded. And so, yeah, we should have a bit more malleability, and certainly until our mid-20s, the kind of basic the basic development of our brain isn't yet complete. You know, it happens in our mid-20s. So if you catch it early enough, then, you know, the brain is still going through the kind of development that happens through adolescence and into our early 20s. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that they can't change their brains. We have this thing called neuroplasticity as adults. It's just that it'll come probably in a slightly different way.
So there are 3 catalysts that you speak of in the book that help us grab a hold of this performance curve and ride it, for want of a better word. They are wisdom, fuel, and connection. Just before we dive into each of those in a bit more detail, talk to me about the 3 of them from a top level point of view, and how do they help us in life?
So yeah, the 3 catalysts really work together and build up very nicely. So the first catalyst, wisdom, is actually understanding what we call our inner operating system. So understanding, we've already mentioned a few of those things of our core drivers and mindsets, our emotions, and also our habits. So the things that we do repeatedly. And actually having a solid capacity to be able to identify what is at play within us and how to work with that. That's the wisdom catalyst. Then the second catalyst and fuel consists of a variety of different ways we can do this consistently and day to day, because that's the trick really. It's not the big out, and when we talked about is it easier when we're younger or later. What we always need, regardless of age, is that consistency and making small changes daily that then compound. And there's a number of different ways that we can really fuel this inner development over time that helps us do that in a way that gives us energy. So it's not that we're constantly feel we're fighting with ourselves or need to change things. And then lastly, connection is about doing this together and supporting and helping each other to bring our best and to grow our best. So it's how we can use our relationships, our conversations, the cultures we're operating in, to help us be on that journey and be on the performance curve.
So a big part of wisdom, as you say in the book, is working on your inner operating system, and that is taking control of things like your mindset, your emotions, and your habits. What goes into that process, and what is the outcome on the other side once you have a stronger internal operating system?
So, as you say, Sean, the pieces of the inner operating system are really our mindsets, our emotional responses, and our habits. And our belief is that we need to better understand how to take charge of each of those things, and that starts by recognizing them. So it starts by being able to notice when a mindset is passing through our head, especially repeatedly, and what the outcome of that is. So is it influencing our responses, and if so, is that helpful or unhelpful? And if it's not helping us, how can we shift that mindset to something more constructive? So, for example, if I have a mindset that, being close to my clients and being in meetings is an important way that I add value, and actually I realize that's leading me to a behavior of always saying yes to meetings even when I don't need to be there and some of my team could be there instead, then I can see that that's leading to overwhelm and probably, frankly, me doing less good work overall. Then I can actually realize that's unhelpful, and I can shift to something else. I can shift to a more constructive mindset, like I can add most value by going to the most essential meetings and leaving the team to do a really good job in the other ones. And that's going to lead me to have a different behavior. And obviously, I'm going to say no to some meetings, and the team's going to do a better job without me, frankly, because I'll get out of their way, and I'm going to be able to spend my time on other things that where I can uniquely add value. So that kind of awareness of mindsets and shifting of mindsets, I think, is really the starting point for working on our inner operating systems. That said, we also know that working on our emotions and working on our habits is very, very key. And we cover a lot in the second catalyst, the fuel catalyst, about habits, which we can come on to and talk about in a moment. And I know that it's also a subject of interest to you. And then likewise, also raising our awareness about our emotions. And, many of us, that would often be the orphan, if you like, the thing that we would pay less attention to, or we would have less acuity around recognizing what our emotions are. So we've really tried to lay out in the book some techniques for building our awareness of emotions and being able to recognize, distinguish between them and name them and so on. Because once we understand that, emotions can then be clues to what's going on for us with our mindsets, and just allows us to, frankly, even just naming an emotion allows our brain to settle itself down and bring us back to our better thinking or a better functioning. I think another part of this, another important part of the wisdom catalyst, is having a bit of a route map for what looks like or what can be the most effective ways of shifting and developing our mindset. So we talk a bit in that part of the book about some mindsets that we found generally are very helpful for people. So many people are familiar with the growth mindset, the work that was done by Carol Dweck and colleagues, and now many other people around the world, and how much of a difference to our brains and our performance the growth mindset can make. But we also talk about the accountable mindset, or taking personal responsibility, and again, how that gives us a greater sense of control and choice in difficult situations. And then also about another mindset we call the big picture mindset, which is taking a wider view, a wider perspective about what really matters. And I think when we start to have some of those route maps to how to develop our mindsets and our inner operating system, then that can also be a very powerful combination with the mindset shifting technique that I just described earlier.
So Vanessa, I know you have a background in meditation, and I have, for the 4th or 5th time this year, tried my hardest to build a meditation habit, because I buy into the benefits. I am just not great at consistently sticking to it. But something that I've been learning recently in trying to build a meditation habit is this idea, to pick up on your point, Laura, of emotions. This idea that emotions, to a certain extent at least, are somewhat controllable, right? I look at the 3 areas there in the wisdom catalyst of mindset, emotions, and habits, and mindsets and habits at least feel and look and seem quite controllable, whereas before a few weeks ago, I would say with 100% certainty, emotions aren't controllable. You can't control them. There's nothing you can do about them. But to pick up on your point, Laura, it's interesting that when you notice an emotion and you notice the kind of the physical, or the feeling, for want of a better phrase, that each particular emotion gives you, just that act of noticing an emotion almost stops you in your tracks and stops you falling onto this boom and bust, adrenaline-fueled curve of acting through emotion. So do you have any tips of how somebody can, be less emotive in their decision-making and allow their emotions to drive them less?
Yeah, so what you're describing is beautiful, Sean, this sense of like a river of the emotion, and we can sort of fall into it and it sweeps us away. And something that can help is just the naming. Laura mentioned it earlier. Just naming the emotion is a bit like dipping the toe in the river, but not jumping into it. So even being able to identify what is actually this emotion we feel and experience emotions through our physical being, and sometimes that can also help to, if we can't quite name it yet, it's just to name the sensation in the body. So starting somewhere in the naming process, because that creates like a little distance to the emotion. We're not in the river, we're sort of seeing it, we're interacting with it, but we're not letting it sweep us away. And that's where it can then all start and unfold and really take us on a different journey, following through with the emotions, because we, in some ways, I would agree with you that we can't directly control emotions. If you're feeling angry and saying, I don't want to feel angry, if we're suppressing it, that actually doesn't work. It does come out sideways, and there's a lot of signs showing it doesn't work in any particular way, and it's not helpful for us. So it's important that we acknowledge and actually allow ourselves to feel the emotion. But what we can control is how we're then relating to the emotion. So the sense of, how am I in relationship to it? Am I in the river? Am I dipping my toe in? Am I resisting it? Do I not even want to go close to it? And then it becomes really interesting when we're exploring that sense of space, because then we can find, oh, okay, maybe this isn't so strong. It doesn't carry me away if I get into contact with that emotion. We can start inquiring, what is that emotion actually telling me? If I'm just coming from a bit more of that observer position, what is it about? What is the message or the gift here? And anger, since I mentioned it, for example, the gift is to give us the energy to hold our ground, to stand up for something, to speak our truth or our values. So it's a really important energy we need to have as human beings, and we can't just strip it away. So then having that inquiry of what is it trying to tell me that I'm feeling, can then really help us on that journey to living a life well lived, because it might be telling us something really important about what matters to us, our values, and where we might not be in integrity with it, and help us get back into integrity and take action that is in line with what really matters with us.
Sure. I have a very vivid memory of one of the first times I was working with Vanessa, and we were standing in the lobby of a client, waiting to go in and do some work together that afternoon, and things were going very well with this project, and we loved working with the client in the main, but there was a particular issue that they had been pushing on, and I had been getting really frustrated about it. And I was really very frustrated, and I would say uncharacteristically kind of challenged and set back by this particular situation. And Vanessa said to me, like, well, what are you feeling? What's actually going on? And I'm like, you know what, I think I'm angry, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, because anger's not really the emotion that I feel most often. I'm more of a kind of I'd put myself in more of the anxious category. That tends to be how I feel. But I was genuinely angry, and when I admitted it, I was like, oh, okay, that already feels a little bit better. And then she said, well, okay, anger, that's a really good clue of something that you care deeply about, something in some way that you feel is, I don't know, a boundary that's been violated, or something that's really driving you to feel angry. What is it? And I'm like, oh, okay, actually, I think that this particular thing that's going on just isn't fair. It doesn't feel right and fair to me, and there must be a better way to handle it. And gradually she calmed me down and settled me down. And that process then led me to, obviously, well, what am I going to do about it, and what's the conversation I need to have? And I was able to then that afternoon actually have the conversation with the client and come to a different solution. And it was actually a non-drama conversation. I think we found an outcome in about 10 minutes with, no particular stress on either side. And I couldn't have done that without that process of naming the emotion. Why are you feeling that way? Okay, what are you going to do about it? And so it's a very simple process that Vanessa describes there, but I think it is incredibly powerful.
It's interesting, and I've genuinely never heard this before, this idea of reframing emotions as important and useful and necessary indicators of something. Because I'll be the first to admit that when it comes to having any sort of emotion, within reason, right, I suppress it to an extent, right? If I'm angry with a work situation, because of the kind of person I am, I don't necessarily address the reason for that anger. I just hold on to it. Similarly, if I'm, sad about something, other than in select circumstances, I'll be like, okay, I'll deal with this myself. But actually, it's really interesting to hear both of your stance that emotions are not only necessary, but actually really useful to suggest what your next course of action should be if you were to act on them pragmatically.
Absolutely. And there is plenty of reliable data where they put people in brain scanners and look at the effect on the brain of either following some sort of track of the kind that we just described versus attempting to suppress an emotion. And it's really, really clear that our brains settle down into a more productive state, what we would call something closer to an explore state rather than a protect state, so the fight or flight defensive reaction, much more effectively. And suppression, if anything, will actually increase a protect state in the brain.
Yeah, I'm really glad, Sean, you're picking up on this particular aspect. It's very close to my own heart, because I had to learn, and still am learning, what my emotions are and what I'm feeling in a moment. Before my burnout, when somebody asked me how are you feeling, I would give a long description of what I've been doing kind of all day, or the thoughts going through my head, but actually not really what I was feeling, because I didn't know, and I didn't have a language even for it. And so I started off just learning, what does my anger feel like? What are the variations of anger? Irritation, annoyance, feeling grumpy, crabby. There's lots of different words, and the more fine we can actually be in articulating those flavors actually is shown to have a beneficial impact for our brains, for our immunity. It's called emotional granularity, and there's very interesting research on that. And it's really for that reason that it gives us such a powerful access to then working with mindsets and our habits as well, and our whole inner operating system. But it's often underplayed because it can be something emotional we feel uncomfortable with, or want to push aside, or it's an inconvenience. But really, it's lovely to hear how you're identifying that gift in them, because that means we can then actually really live wholeheartedly. We can't just switch off one emotion and only, or keep one emotion, only have the good stuff in life. It's kind of all those different flavors matter, and they're all important clues to have a life where we really feel it's well lived and not just on paper. So coming back to that notion of success as well, right? It's a feeling state rather than something we're thinking or doing.
Something else you talk about in the Wisdom Catalyst is this idea of hidden drivers. What are they, and how do we uncover our hidden drivers and then take charge of them?
So our hidden drivers are mindsets, but they're really some of the deepest, most embedded mindsets in our brains. And they're likely to have grown up with us from really quite a young age. And we usually will have a couple of these hidden drivers that drive us quite strongly. So for me, I've already alluded earlier to one around needing to feel valuable or be seen as valuable. So that sense of value, am I adding value in the world, really matters to me a lot. And it really bothers me a lot when I feel like I'm being useless or not adding value. Like that really for me is a red flag. Any opportunity I get to add value, somebody saying to me, oh, it'd be really useful if you came to this meeting, I'm like, oof. Anytime that somebody says, oh, Laura, that was so useful, it makes me feel amazing. Equally, if I feel like I haven't been useful in some way, I feel quite threatened about that. That will, wind me up and put me into something of a protect state. So there are a number of these different hidden drivers, and we lay out some of them in the book, at least the ones that we have found to cover, most people that we come across and work on this material with. And others of them might be, for example, a need to feel connected, close to people, a need for a sense of integrity and doing the right thing, or a need to feel strong and independent. I had a grandma who's sadly no longer with us, who was just, a model of that sort of sense of independence and desire for autonomy right to the very end of her life. It was, really remarkable in how it drove her to manage her life. But other members of my family obviously bring, many different flavors of these hidden drivers, and it's makes for a rich and colourful life. But the point is that these drivers then influence a lot our mindset. So they'll often be the ones that are kind of fueling and driving a lot of the other mindsets that lead to what we do. So if I have a need to feel valuable, then, I'm going to have a mindset like, I can add value by being in meetings, or need to say yes to projects when clients ask because, that's a request for me to add value, whereas actually maybe I'm not the best person to do that. And I could think about doing it, to passing on the work to somebody else, or saying no, or whatever it is. So it's by raising our awareness of these hidden drivers, we can then start to make choices more deliberately about how they how they guide our lives. So in some senses, we can drive them, we can have them drive our lives rather than be driven by them without really being aware of it.
So a process I've heard in the past, and correct me if this is completely off track, but I've heard that a really useful way to uncover your values, your real values, and I guess in a sense, therefore, your real hidden drivers, is not to sit down with a bit of A4 paper and write down my values are X, Y, Z, but to look at the recurring patterns of things you do in life and then dive into what is driving me to do that, right? So you speak about wanting to be useful and wanting to be value driven. And so, of course, that manifests in lots of different things you do in life. Do you have a process that people can follow to maybe look at the patterns that they always fall into, look at the things they always choose to do first, and then derive their hidden drivers from that?
So, Sean, absolutely. I think there are a few different ways into this. One way is, as you say, to look at patterns of behavior. And actually, the method that we encourage people to most often follow is to focus on this notion of protect and explore states in the brain, because we believe that the hidden drivers are the fast track route to being in explore state or being drawn into protect state. Anytime we see an opportunity to meet our needs, we're drawn towards explore state, and anytime we have a real sense of threat, the chances are that that's somehow going to touch back to our hidden drivers. So we ask people to think about times when they're most often in protect state or most often in explore state, and then peel back, why did you feel that way, or why do you feel that way, and what's that telling you? And actually, we'll often, as preparation for leadership programs, rather than have people do 360s or anything like that, just go around observing themselves for a couple of weeks. When are you in protect state? What puts you in there? When are you in explore state? What puts you in there? And then work with that to decode back to the drivers that fuel them most strongly. So those are definitely methods you can use. The set of hidden drivers that we outline in the book comes from a methodology called the Enneagram, which I'm a great fan of, and I've followed that school of thought for some time. And again, references in the book as to how people can take questionnaires and explore that more. So that's one method to get to hidden drivers. There are also a number of other instruments, psychometric tests psychometric techniques that will help get to hidden drivers through that more structured route.
So the second catalyst in the book is fuel. So we have now worked out what drives us, we've worked on all of these base level foundations, and we've developed our internal operating system. How do we stay moving on the performance curve?
Yeah, so a really, really big aspect is having a sense of purpose. Like a North Star, what is that even for? Why do I even want to be on the performance curve? What really matters in that sense in my life? What gives me a sense of purpose and makes life meaningful? Because all this inner work is also work. It takes effort, and unless there's a reason to put that effort into it, and we know that it is, we're missing out on an important sense of fuel. And that doesn't need to be a big save the world kind of purpose. It could be much, much smaller and something we can build into every day. So, for example, it could be a sense for just wanting to bring my best to every interaction I have, because that we might see that as being the foundation for really bringing out our potential and helping others bring out their potential as well. So how do I do this in this conversation or in this meeting now? How can I bring more of that into it? And that can really help us day to day. The second thing we would really put in here is to have what we call a performance curve habit. So in your case, it might be meditation you're getting into, something we really do regularly that helps us build our self-awareness and our self-management. And that could be something we do more with a mind, with a head, so working with mindsets, could be working more with the emotions, the heart aspect, maybe with our hands, actually drawing or making things. So there's different what we call channels to access really our inner worlds, or moving our bodies as well, regular exercise, or just putting on music in your kitchen and having a bit of a dance around, something that shifts our inner focus. And those are then the check-in moments and little practices that really compound over time to help us also when it's really intense in the heat of the moment to be able to take that step back and say, where am I coming from? Am I in protect now? Am I more in explored? If I'm in protect, how do I reset myself? And that in itself builds like a muscle, that ability to reset. And of all the people we interviewed for the book, it was one of the most consistent things throughout, even though they came from very different walks of life, is that they had a set of practices they would do regularly, whether they needed it or not, in order to have it ready for when they needed it.
It sounds like a lot of this fuel on the performance curve comes down to having a really clear guiding purpose or set of purposes. How do you go about finding what your purpose really is, especially in such an independent world where we're all told to fend for ourselves and that our success is up to us, but there's little meaning and there's little happiness to be found in just looking after yourself and just looking after your bank and these kind of things. How do we find real purpose that will actually fuel us?
Yeah. So we define 2 characteristics in the book of what makes for a powerful purpose. The first one is that it's really matters to us, like it's heartfelt, it resonates with us emotionally. The second one is that it is bigger than just ourselves or our immediate friends or family, so not coming from a sense of self-serving in a way. Very simple. It's a matter of playing detective or turning detective on yourself for a little bit as well, and just paying attention to the times where that you experience a sense of joy. Or where you're doing something in life and asking yourself, what is that? What really lights me up and is also serving something bigger at the same time? Because those are then the clues that help us identify what could give us a bigger purpose. And it might be originally starting off with something like just enjoying nature and finding, when I'm out in greenery and nature, how can I bring a bit more of that into it, and maybe things from there develop. So starting small is really important with purpose, and changes over time anyway for most people. So it doesn't need to be immediately, I'm going to go out into the jungle and save the orangutans. So it doesn't, for some people that might be the case, but in order to bring purpose into our lives and fuel us, it doesn't need to be that big thing or big action. And it's more about paying attention to it day to day and then taking a step at a time and then building it from there on.
You speak in the book about paradoxical thinking. What is that?
So quite often in our lives, we'll feel under pressure to make some kind of choice or trade-off. So shall I be more effective or shall I have well-being is a really good example of that. But in companies or when we're making individual choices, we're likely to face those trade-offs on a fairly regular basis. Shall I work hard today or go outside and enjoy the fresh air? Shall I invest in my operations in Germany or in France? Shall I spend my budget on marketing or on research and development? There's many of these choices that we have to make, and very often we'll frame them at exactly as I've just done, as a either or choice. Or perhaps we might then realize that there'll be some kind of trade-off that we can make. We're like, I could work at my desk really hard for a couple of hours and then I could go and get half an hour of sun at the end, or I could spend half my budget on France and half in Germany, and so on. Paradoxical thinking challenges that notion that we have to choose between one thing or the other. It says actually, if we are smart and challenging in our thinking and we manage to bring enough freshness to it, enough creativity, there's probably a way where we can actually unlock this paradox and have the two kind of choices or trade-offs, the polarities, if you like, complement each other in some way. So in the way that we've outlined, in fact, the performance curve is an attempt to bring paradoxical thinking to performance. We're trying to say, look, if we can boost our well-being, we can have more effectiveness. If we can have more effectiveness, we can boost our well-being. And the unlock for that is to work on our inner operating system. If we actually stop thinking about just being effective or just having well-being, and we actually think about working on our inner operating system, we'll actually unlock both things, and the two will become mutually reinforcing or complementary. And the same applies to some of these other examples. Well, what if instead of choosing between marketing and research and development, we were actually to say, is there a way that we can do our R&D that gets us marketing publicity? Or could we somehow have, a competition for R&D that got us visibility and publicity, brought people in. So we start to think about creative solutions rather than accepting this either or choice. And we have found, and we've worked with clients on this, that it's actually a very powerful way of doing more with less. So a very powerful way of essentially getting effectiveness without having to put quite so much into it, getting results without having to put quite so much in. So that's why we put quite an emphasis on it in the book, because it is something that can fuel us to be on the performance curve.
I was smiling during your answer there because I have your book in front of me and I'm reading the subtitle. And that paradox is almost the buy-in for this entire thing, right? To go back to what I spoke at the very beginning, we have been led to believe that success and well-being are mutually exclusive. And I followed that path for a few years. Like I said, for the last 2 years or so, I've been trying to tread both paths with varying levels of success. But it almost seems that without truly believing that you can actually have both, without truly believing that one feeds the other and isn't obtained at the cost of the other, none of this makes sense. So it's really interesting to hear that answer. So the third catalyst is connection. What role does connection play in all of this?
So in connection, I would say that that's where it all comes together, because we don't operate in isolation as human beings. When we talk about our inner operating system, the way it actually formed in childhood is actually in interaction with other people, through the experiences we have together, etc. And that's where an incredible power also lies to help us then be on the performance curve and operate in much more of an explore way, creating the life we really want to live, when we have people around us who are supporting us in that. And it's a huge potential to actually become more aware of ourselves when we have people around us who also bring an approach of wanting to do so for themselves, and can help us in identifying what is really driving us. The conversation Laura described, we're doing that for each other, with each other, to really help us identify where am I getting stuck now, asking each other some questions, etc. So there's a huge potential to actually do this work with each other and therefore create much more impact, not just ourselves, but also in the lives of the people around us, and help them have better lives as well. So with our friends and family and the communities we're interacting with. And it doesn't need to be a sort of deep therapy session. It could be just a couple of questions of, well, how are you really feeling about this? What would you really do if there weren't any constraints? What would you like to see happen? And it can be through the little conversations that we actually pull each other up to a higher level rather than the down to the lowest common denominator. And that's what's behind the catalyst there in particular of how to do that in one-to-ones or looking at cultures and more systemically, so that we can collectively help each other bring our best to solve those problems we're facing on the planet today, which are challenging, which are difficult, which are beyond any of us alone, where we need to work together and really bring our collective best as well.
And do you have any pieces of advice or frameworks of how we as individuals can find almost the confidence within ourselves to be the first mover in that situation? Because when we look at our world right now, whether it's the fact that none of us speak to our neighbours, whether it's the fact that we have small talk and nothing else of our colleagues, or whether we walk past people in the street who may need help or who may have an interesting story and neglect to even speak to them, it seems as though we're in this environment where nobody talks to anybody, nobody has these developmental relationships. And so the onus is almost on us as individuals to begin them, to get that ball rolling. How do we do that?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts. Sean, can you say just first of all a bit more in terms of what the barrier is? Because very often it's identifying the barrier. I mean, I could also talk to why not just kind of do it, but often it's about understanding the barrier that helps us unlock it to move forwards.
So in both my experience, but also observing those around me, it almost seems to be that there is a social norm. Maybe this says a lot about me and the people I know, but there's a social norm that you just don't necessarily speak openly about these things, look at how you can assist others and kind of build as a collective rather than just focusing on yourself. And to break outside of that, to start these conversations, to begin talking to people in the way you describe, you almost need to find that confidence within yourself to be the one who's a bit weird to begin with, to fall outside of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like we have individual mindsets in ourselves that are just recurring thinking patterns or certain assumptions we're making, the same operates at a collective level of what relationships look like, what we talk about, what we don't talk about, norms. In society, what is done, British culture has particular ways that you might be alluding to there as well, of just don't talk about those kinds of things, whereas some other cultures might be much more open to show their emotions, for example, when you're thinking more of Latin cultures. So there are cultural mindsets and ways of behaving, and yes, to create different results means doing something differently, and that takes courage. So a couple of things there, if that's around finding that courage or the confidence to do that, if you know that that is something you actually really want to do, is to ask yourself, well, what do you have to lose? What if you didn't do it? What would you look like? What would your life look like? Do you want to be that person? And actually, that can help unlock it. Or in a more positive way, what could be the result of that? What could you create by being a bit courageous and breaking the mold a bit? What would I think it's something it allows you to get personally in touch with something that really matters to you there, and that fuels you to then take the action and have the courage to break through something that might be instigating a bit of fear, to stick your head out of the mold in that way. And I can definitely relate to that. How often do I go about doing some shopping and just head down, or this is just me in the supermarket, when I'm noticing something of somebody maybe struggling or being angry about something, and what makes you actually stop and ask, can I help you? So, and to me, that's then often questions around who do I actually want to be, and what might happen if I didn't do something. Some thoughts there, Laura. Do you want to add?
So Sean, I can add something here. I think Vanessa's talked about how we can relate to people that we perhaps don't know so well and make steps towards having a more authentic, vulnerable conversation with them. And I think that's part of this. I also think that another way to build that connection is to think about who in your life you're already relatively close to, but perhaps you're not stepping into the territory of inner operating systems. And how might you be able to do that? And that might be family members, close friends, or even work colleagues, and saying, actually, you know what, let me pick one or two people and just see if I can build a tighter connection in the way that we would describe it, that supports us both to grow our inner operating systems. And then once you've got more of a model for that with a couple of people, you can then think about the other people where you'd like to continue to do more of that in your life, as you and Vanessa are alluding to. I have a very close friend with whom over the last several years we've worked hard together to do this, and we actually do it through the vehicle of setting New Year's intentions together. So we think a bit about what we want to accomplish in a year, or have the year be like, what we want to experience, and then we talk a lot about how we're going to do that, the barriers and the challenges to get there. And it's not simply the New Year's resolution of I want to go running 3 times a week. It's much more profound than that, about the choices we're making in our lives, what holds us back. It's really inner operating system territory. And I think, having that relationship with my close friend and doing that each year, it's been hugely enriching for both of us. And I think a large part of how I've gotten through the challenges I faced in parts of the last few years has been because of the support of that tight connection. And then I think that's also given me confidence to shift the nature of my relationship with some of my other friends to get to that territory faster, because I know what that looks like as a friend. I know what I can bring, and I know how much benefit there is for me as well.
So another of the really important components of connection in the book is the idea of leaning into both vulnerability and empathy. And much in the same way that we spoke about emotions being this thing that seem like you can't really control them, right? It's almost as if we think we're pre-exposed to either be vulnerable or not, to be empathetic or not. For example, I have a really good friend and they say that they have no empathy whatsoever, and they just kind of dismiss it like, okay, that's how I was born, that's fine, let's move on. How can we go about building more vulnerability, being comfortable with being vulnerable, and also trying to be more empathetic?
So it's interesting, Sean, what you mention around some of these challenges around bringing empathy in particular. And I'm going to leave Vanessa to talk more about that, because she's much more experience in the methods for building, for developing and strengthening our techniques here. But I wanted to say one thing as a neuroscientist, which is we're of course all born with slightly different brain machinery, and some of us are going to have more natural capacities to be able to build empathy than others. That said, what we're really trying to encourage is for people to work with their starting point, to develop techniques that allow them to take their empathy a step on, whatever the starting points. And what we've tried to do is very much think, how can we offer techniques to people and work with people in a way that allows them to just move forward wherever they are, once they're clear that that's something they want to do, to be able to build more connection. But perhaps over to you, Vanessa, because I'm sure you're going to talk more about how people can do that.
Yeah, so if people want to increase their capacity for vulnerability and empathy in order to have richer relationships, and maybe your friend is in that category or maybe he's not, but if that's something we decide for ourselves that we want to try out and bring more into, there's really a bunch of different things that are very simple that we can do. And it starts with what we already covered a bit of, really being able to identify the emotions in ourselves. So first of all, bringing a empathy to us. So empathy means I'm able to actually feel somebody else's emotions, even without them saying directly what they are, and step into their shoes to really experience their experience, what is going on for them. I can only do that, and there's really interesting brain stuff around that as well. I can only really do to the extent that I'm able to inhabit these experiences or emotions myself. So it starts with those basics of building the emotional muscles of being able to identify if I'm feeling sad or disappointed or irritated, etc. Because that means I'm okay feeling that in me, and that means I'm okay feeling that in somebody else. So that's really important for building empathy. And then the vulnerability is actually sharing that, letting other people see that in myself, even when it's hard. So vulnerability is from having a sense of fear of being exposed or rejected or embarrassed perhaps when exposing something about myself. And again, it's something that we have certain beliefs about, maybe from past experiences, or there are certain situations where it's not helpful to be more vulnerable. So to be smart about it as well, and saying, who is somebody I want to be more open with and have a deeper level of connection and share more of myself, and invite them to see if they also want to share more of themselves in that way. And then it can really be this very nice dance of empathy and vulnerability. I'm being a bit more vulnerable, showing something about myself. And then if that's met in an empathetic way, it encourages me to be then even more vulnerable, and the two kind of then build on each other. And our brains actually produce, or for many cases, produce what's called oxytocin. It's known as a bonding hormone, which makes it easier to see the other person really as like me, and have and I'm not saying the same, but as somebody, there is a we instead of an enemy or somebody who might be threatening me, and build a closer bond. That is really, really important for what we just talked about, developing together, is to feel safe and being able to expose what lies below the surface in our operating system, because then we can work with it. But knowing that the other person will still see me as valuable, or still see me as a human being who deserves to be treated kindly, etc., and not be judged or rejected.
Anecdotally, at least, there's an interesting feedback loop also between those two that I've discovered with this podcast. Not to get too meta by talking about the podcast on the podcast, but I've been doing this for 105, 106 weeks at this point, and the general format of this, when I don't have guests on like the two of you, is I just sit and I talk about my life and I disclose everything that's happened in a week, and that sitting here and being honest and telling my truth to whoever will listen for so long has taught me that being vulnerable is okay, and that being vulnerable is a net positive in life. And it was only when I was comfortable with being vulnerable that actually I grew more empathy, if empathy is something you grow, in as much as for as long as the barrier stands in front of you that you feel that you can't be vulnerable and that you feel that you can't be truthful and honest, in my experience at least, it becomes very difficult to be empathetic, at least vocally, because as soon as you empathize with somebody and say, I can relate, I'm similar, this or that, you're almost by default then having to be vulnerable. Does that make sense? Like they're nicely connected if you let one play on the other.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting what you're describing there, Sean. I remember also times in my earlier life when I thought when people were maybe crying in public or showing that, it's like, oh, that's a bit weak or pathetic. So their vulnerability, I couldn't actually be empathetic towards, because I wasn't allowing myself to have that vulnerability and acknowledge those emotions, yet alone show them to anybody. And then actually through being more okay, like you're describing, with the vulnerability and seeing also the richness in our human experience, and then sharing that, suddenly I started to see, wow, how courageous for somebody to show that they care so much about something that they're showing their tears in public, for example, and how our interpretation of what we're seeing can really change so significantly based on where we ourselves are coming from and what we've uncovered and our own inner operating system is really fascinating to me. And I'm really glad to hear that you've made those experiences as well. Yeah. Hopefully inspiring and encouraging other people to open up more as well, and that they don't have to carry all their burdens by themselves through life. Yeah.
So something that this book, or the writing process of this book, has allowed you to do is have really interesting conversations with really interesting individuals all around the idea of redefining performance and success, and not neglecting well-being as a byproduct of that. Generally speaking, from a high-level point of view, what are the commonalities between the individuals you spoke to, and what did they teach you?
Yeah, so the interview conversation process for this book was just such a privilege, a gift, a rich experience. I approached it with some trepidation, I have to say. I was a bit nervous, and then I realized it wasn't really about me, and I just needed to ask the questions, and these wonderful people that we asked to participate gave us such a rich set of answers, and we chose people who are very diverse. So there's some very successful business people from very different business sectors. There's some people in the more kind of humanitarian charity space. There's some people in the performance space, people who have achieved great feats. There's really quite a range of ages, genders, nationalities, and everything in the group of people that we chose. But there were definitely some commonalities, as you outlined. And I think one of those was a very clear sense of purpose. So everybody knew what they were really trying to bring. And perhaps that sense of purpose had shifted a little bit over the years. For some people, it was there when they were 20 and it was still broadly the same. For others, it had migrated a bit, but it was very clear. I think a second thing that was a real surprise to me was how deliberate they were about planning their year. And I mentioned that I have a kind of yearly planning process with my close friend, but their level of planning for the year took it to another level. So many of them would have a sense of, this is what this year's about. And by the way, I'm going to break this down into quarters, and I'm going to break the quarters down into months, and I'm going to break the months down into weeks and daily, and I'm going to communicate it with my team. There was just a very, very clear sense. And they would often, many of them, have a yearly moment where they took stock. So for some it was a retreat, for others it was a family holiday and they take a couple of days out, for others it was a conversation in the way that I described, where they would really step back and look back and reflect backwards and then think forwards. And they might adjust, of course, things don't always go according to plan, as we've found particularly over the last couple of years, but they would be very deliberate about having that shape their year. And I think that would have been a large part of success for many of these people, because they were so deliberate and thoughtful about it. And then I think finally, Vanessa alluded to this earlier, but many of them, if not all of them, had some form of practices. They might appear superhuman on the outside, but actually, of course, they're human beings, just with a super way of bringing their best. That's really what it came down to. And whether it was getting through great adventures, challenging performances, leading in complex business setups, they had some kind of practices that allowed them to prepare to bring their best each day and reset in the moment. And sometimes they weren't even necessarily completely aware of what those practices were, but when we started asking them about it, they're like, yeah, you're right, I have this, and I have this, and I have this. And those things they'd accumulated over the years were adjusted, brought in new practices they needed to in new situations, and were very dear to them and to their way of operating daily.
So if somebody's been listening to this and they think that this all sounds brilliant, I want to get off of that boom and bust curve, I want to get onto the performance curve, and they might want to read the book, but they know that it's going to take a couple of days to arrive, and they're feeling really motivated to make a change right now in the moment. What's one thing they can do to get started on this journey?
Great. So one thing would be to pick something that you want to do differently. And don't make it a massive kind of thing of, I want to spend an hour meditating each day. Make it really small and achievable. So maybe 5 minutes. Or do something, so I mean a practice that allows you to just spend a bit of time with yourself, to get into that sense of self-awareness, self-management, sense of bringing your best and getting used to being aware of just, am I in protect or explore, and shifting that. And then commit to just that. Make if it's, start every day with dancing to your favorite music track, or if it's the sit-down meditation, just pick something and then commit to it that you will do it that day, regardless of the time. Even if you're intending to do it in the morning, if you don't do it in the morning, don't like, oh, I missed it to tomorrow morning, but make sure you do it that day and really commit. Even if it's 11 p.m. or midnight and you want to go to bed and you're dead tired, and even then I will still do it because it's so important that I do it today. And that is really what built such a powerful muscle to do any changes. And I found that really once I committed to doing something regular like that, it became much easier to make the time in the morning because I knew I couldn't avoid it. I couldn't escape from it. There was no pushing it off. I would be doing it anyway. So that would be the singular thing. Pick something small and commit to doing it.
Amazing. Your book, The Performance Curve, Maximize Your Potential at Work While Strengthening Your Wellbeing, is out right now. I'm going to make sure that there is a link in the show notes for anybody who wants to go and grab themselves a copy. In the meantime, where can people go to connect with you online or find out more about the work that you do more generally?
So we've got a website for the book, and you find our details on there as well, and that's www.performancecurvebook.com.
Amazing. Laura, Vanessa, thank you both so much.